You're lying in bed at the end of a long day trying to sleep, but the events of your day keep running through your head over and over again. They're making you toss and turn. When you're just about to finally drift off, you hear. It jars you awake, forces you out of bed. It's coming from your front door. You look out your window to see who could possibly be banging on your door at this time of night. There's no car outside, so whoever it is must have walked there. You check your ring cam to see who's there. Through your phone, you see 2 young children standing at your door, waiting for you to answer. What do you do? Tonight, we're discussing one of the most disturbing modern paranormal legends ever reported. The Black-Eyed Kids, also known as BEK or Black-Eyed Children. At first glance, these stories read more like spooky campfire tales than real-life events. But once you look into it a little deeper, the sheer volume of different reports containing eerily similar details makes this phenomenon much harder to dismiss. And whether this is folklore, hysteria, paranormal activity, or something even worse, by the end of this video, you'll understand why so many people say the same thing. If they ever show up at your door, do not let them in. First reported encounter with Black-Eyed Kids came from Texas reporter Brian Bethel in 1996. After finishing some late work at the local newspaper in Abilene, he was sitting in his car in the parking lot of a strip mall in front of a movie theater. The parking lot was mostly empty with the exception of a couple of parked cars. As far as he could tell, there was no one around. He needed to pay his internet bill, so he took out his checkbook and began writing using the light from the marquee of the theater to see. The internet service provider had a drop box in this mall, so to him, it was just another normal errand during another normal night. But then, out of nowhere, startled, he jumped. 2 young boys, somewhere between 9 and 13 years old, dressed in hooded sweatshirts, stood outside. Although he admits he was more focused on writing his check than he was on observing his surroundings, this moment seemed almost like an impossible reality shift. One moment, there was no one around. And the next moment, they were right there, next to his car, close enough to knock on the window. Almost as if they had materialized out of thin air. Brian cracked the window just a bit to talk with them. He expected them to ask him for money. He was immediately gripped by what he described as an incomprehensible, soul-racking fear. But he had no idea why. He initially chalked this up to his surprise at their sudden appearance. One of the boys, who appeared slightly older, stepped forward and said,
"Hello, sir. Can you help us? We want to see the movie, but we accidentally left our money at our mother's house. Could you please give us a ride there? It won't take long. It's not far."
Brian thought this was plausible enough, but all through the exchange, that feeling of fear, it just continued to grow. A feeling his brain believed to be irrational, but he just couldn't explain it. He didn't understand it. It was something within him, in his gut, more ancient than logic or rationalization. He just felt that something was wrong. The child was insistent and continued pushing.
"We're just 2 little kids."
Brian looked up at the marquee, saw the show times, and noticed that the movie had already started. By the time he took them anywhere and back, it would practically be over already.
"It's not like we have a gun or anything."
That was unnerving. But there was increasing pressure building inside Brian's head. As the voice spoke, the things he said sounded less and less like the voice of a young teen and more like a demand being placed directly inside his brain. Almost like the words were bypassing his ears entirely. Brian noticed that his hand had been drifting toward the lock on the door unconsciously, like it almost had a mind of its own, or like it was obeying those demands without his consent. This is when he first made real eye contact with the boy who had been talking. Light hit the boy's face at just the right angle to illuminate his facial features, and Brian's breath caught in his throat. The boy's eyes were coal black, both boys. No white, no iris, no pupil, just black pits of nothingness. Looking into those eyes was like looking into an endless abyss. He knew he needed to avoid falling into that abyss by any means necessary. Brian quickly snapped out of whatever trance had taken a hold of him and yanked his hand back away from the door, his mind now practically exploding in a wave of sheer terror. His thoughts were racing through his head a mile a minute in total panic. He knew he needed to get out of there as fast as possible. He could barely breathe. Fear had a stranglehold on him, and it was not letting go. Time slowed down. He threw the car into gear and rolled up his window, apologizing and making excuses to the boys as he was moving. And as the window was rolling up, the boy who had been talking banged sharply on it with his fist. His words, angry and menacing, pierced Brian's brain, almost like a psychic knife.
We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay. Let us in!
Brian slammed on the gas and his car screamed halfway across the parking lot before he even looked back to see where he had previously been parked. There was no trace of anyone. The boys had completely vanished just as suddenly as they had appeared. There were no moving cars in the lot, no open doors. They were just gone. The lot was once again as dark and empty as the eyes of those boys had been. Brian headed home with the boys' words echoing repeatedly in his head. It probably goes without saying, but he didn't get a wink of sleep that night. He found himself repeatedly checking locks on the doors and looking through windows for any signs of danger, but there were none. The encounter just played over and over again in his head throughout the night. In the early hours of morning, Brian decided he needed to write down exactly what had happened, more as a means of catharsis than as an actual news story, although he did eventually end up sharing that story with his friends. Soon after, his story spread online, and that's when replies started coming in. Replies from reputable sources, police officers, doctors, teachers, all detailing frightening encounters they'd experienced in their cars, at home, or at work. However, despite the different settings and people involved, the stories are largely the same. 2 children, black eyes, one goal, to be let in. In every iteration of this story, these children require that invitation. They never force their way in without it, although they are always very insistent that they need to get inside. They know that humans are wired with a basic instinct to protect children, and they use that against us. They feign fear, they beg, they plead, they reason, they get angry. They manipulate in any way they can and do whatever they think is necessary to be let in.
Please, it's scary out here in the dark.
My brother really needs to use the bathroom.
Can we come in? It's so cold.
We're just kids.
Can we use your phone to call our mom? We got lost.
One more common detail that appears in every story: the fear and unspeakable terror that those who encounter these children experience. You can't help but feel for them. Whenever you're listening to or reading about their experiences, no one should have to endure that much overwhelming dread. But in a way, those feelings are a good thing. Those who panicked and ran or slammed the door, well, they went on to share their stories and were able to warn others. But what happens to the people who don't react that way? What happens when you let them in? In a rural community in Vermont, an anonymous woman, who we'll refer to as Beth, unfortunately learned the answer to that very question. It was around 2 a.m. and a massive snowstorm had buried the roads outside. Beth was sleeping in bed with her husband, who we'll call Ron, when they heard. Beth sprung to her feet and looked out the window to see what that sound could be. She saw 2 small sets of footprints leading up to the house, but not a car in sight. Her initial instinct was that someone had probably hit a patch of ice, crashed, and walked down the road until they found this house so they could get some help. She quickly shook Ron awake. He was a little groggy at first, but he became fully awake at the next. The couple hurried their way downstairs where Ron opened the door. Standing in the snow were 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy was slightly bigger and older, but still no older than 12 at the most. Both children kept their eyes trained firmly on the ground, and then the boy spoke.
Can we come in?
Ron turned toward Beth with a puzzled look on his face. These children looked a little out of place. Neither one of them was dressed for the cold, even though the boy had a hood on. Beth asked him,
"Where are your parents?"
to which the boy replied,
Parents will be here soon. Can we come in? It's cold out here.
Ron and Beth shared another long, perturbed look before Beth's parental instincts took over. Both of them were clearly uneasy and uncomfortable with this situation, but Beth wasn't going to stand there and let 2 children freeze to death on her front porch. What kind of person would that make her? Normally, she'd help young children without a second thought. But there was this tightness deep in her chest and a pit in her stomach that made her hesitate. She pushed this feeling aside, silently scolding herself for not acting immediately. She ushered the children inside and instructed Ron to go grab them some blankets. She seated them on the sofa in the living room and said she was going to go make them some hot cocoa to warm them up because they had to be freezing. One of the couple's 4 cats, a cat named Pigeon, who had been resting on the couch, immediately darted from the spot in the living room and into the kitchen the moment the kids entered. Pigeon usually loved company, but she thought maybe he was startled by new people visiting so late at night, or maybe he was just reacting to Beth's own uneasiness. Or maybe he felt something was off here too. Beth headed into the kitchen and could hear Ron talking to the children in the next room. She couldn't tell exactly what he was saying to them, but she could tell that he was getting very little detail from them in response. It sounded like most of their responses boiled down to the same phrase: parents will be here soon. As she was listening in and making the cocoa, she noticed that Pigeon was cowering under the table, his eyes locked on the door to the living room. Beth bent down to give him a comforting pet, and Pigeon was so scared he actually hissed at her and pulled back even further. Beth found this very odd, as he'd never done that before. It didn't matter. She had work to do. She finished making the hot cocoa and brought it into the living room for the kids, who were, at this point, sitting there across from Ron, being awkwardly silent. As she walked in with both hands holding hot, steamy cups of cocoa, she just froze in fear. It took everything in her willpower not to drop the cups right where she stood. She hadn't noticed it before, but here in the living room with the lights on, she saw their eyes black as a cloudless night with no stars. Almost like what should have been there had been replaced by coal. She let out an audible gasp. Amazingly, she was somehow able to stifle her impulse to scream. The children both had their eyes firmly trained on her. She was pretty certain of this, although it was a little harder to tell when the entire eye was one color. Beth felt it, though. It was like their gaze somehow lowered the temperature in the entire room. She felt a chill roll down her spine as the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The kids either didn't notice or didn't care about her reaction. They simply both stood up from the couch in unison before the boy said,
We need to use your bathroom.
With that, the 2 kids walked back into the hallway. Ron had been silent during this short interaction. When Beth turned to look at him, he had his hands over his nose. There was some red coming out. It took her a second to recognize that his nose was bleeding. Beth quickly found a tissue for him, and as she was handing it over, she asked,
Did you see their eyes?
Just as that last word had escaped her lips, the power in the entire house went out, as if the house itself were answering her question. Beth turned toward the hallway to check on the children, and she saw them standing there with their backs to the front door, looking at her once again with their obsidian eyes. They appeared to be completely unsurprised and unfazed by the sudden darkness. The boy said,
Our parents are here.
With that, both kids turned toward the front door, opened it, and walked out of the house into the freezing snow beyond, leaving the front door wide open. Beth and Ron, who was still nursing his nosebleed with the tissue Beth had given him, walked over to the door, both to close it and to make sure these kids were really leaving. As creepy as they were to look at and talk to, it was better knowing where they were than being unsure. In the street, they saw a black car idling with 2 tall, slender men standing next to it. Both men were at least 6 feet tall and had pale, almost waxy skin. They were dressed in black suits and gave Beth and Ron an even greater sense of unease. Trying to shake it off, Beth and Ron waved to the men, but the men did not wave back. Instead, the men and the children, now all standing by the car, turned to stare at them for what seemed like an eternity before they all entered the vehicle and drove away. Beth and Ron both felt a huge sense of relief at seeing the strangers go, but unfortunately, the ordeal would only continue in the coming months. Their 3 cats that had remained hidden during the surprise visit that night never returned. Beth and Ron could only pray that they weren't hurt or worse, but after a while, they began to lose hope. Pigeon, the cat seen by the children that night, did not leave them any such room for hope. Ron had found him lying in a pool of his own blood one morning after he had succumbed to a hemorrhage, the cause of which was unknown. Ron himself continued to get nosebleeds after the encounter, and they got bad enough where he decided he needed to go to the doctor. There, he was found to have developed an aggressive form of skin cancer, the kind usually caused by exposure to extreme radiation or decades of sun exposure. And Ron had a history of neither. He passed away shortly after. In Beth's accounting of this experience, she does mention suffering from nosebleeds, dizziness, and an occasional mental fogginess. She doesn't get into specifics about her own health, but she does mention that she's the least healthy she's ever been. She is completely convinced that all her bad luck can be traced back to the night they answered that knock on the door. The night they let them in. What do you think? Were these experiences part of a string of coincidental bad luck following the performance of a good deed? Or did that encounter trigger everything that followed? Are they real? If so, what are they? Children? Demons? Alien-human hybrids? Something else? Some think they're vampires who don't actually drink literal blood, but what that blood represents. Your life force. Whatever they are, one thing is crystal clear. If one night you hear someone knocking, do not let them in. Thanks everyone for watching. If you like this video and you want to hear more stories from the Codex, please make sure to like and subscribe. See you all next time.